Then thank you for joining us for this month's Worksoft webinar, Process Understanding and Test Automation for Better Business Outcomes. My name is Austin Chandler. I'm the Senior Content Manager at Worksoft, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We'll answer a few questions at the end of our presentation. You can use the questions feature to submit one. If we don't get to yours due to time constraints, we'll send you a reply via email. Today, Worksoft Senior Manager of EMEA Solution Engineers, Nick Ioanu, will explore how organizations are driving process optimization through test automation, powered by process understanding, and how business process insight feeds test automation efforts to drive those efforts and reduce risk. The presentation is going to be recorded, and we'll send you a link to the on-demand session for anyone who's would like to share or review the information. Due to the number of participants, we're going to mute the lines, and now I'll go ahead and turn things over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Austin. Hi, everyone. A big welcome from my side, and thanks for taking time to join in this webinar. We usually have people that are connecting from all parts of the world. So depending on where you're connecting from, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. So as Austin's already introduced me, I'm going to skip that part, and we can pretty much just jump in and then start taking a look at what we're going to be covering today. So here's the agenda that's going to be guiding the roadmap for today's discussion. Now, since the topic for today is how process understanding and test automation can and should work together, we're going to first start with a high-level overview of each of those. Now, let me say up front that it's not going to be exhaustive by any means, because each of these is a large domain, each in their own right. And they could each of these be a separate series of webinars. So we're not going to have time to do a exhaustive cover-to-cover kind of view of each of those. But what we're going to rather do is describe them at a high level, because what I really want to get to is then taking a look at how we can combine these disciplines so that we can use process understanding to enhance testing quality and effectiveness. And if implemented and used correctly, it should result in numerous benefits to the business. And then to expand on that, I'll show you how Worksoft is combining process understanding and test automation all in one platform to help deliver those better business results. All right, so first up, we have process understanding. Now, before we define process understanding as a function, let's start by looking at some of the building blocks in this domain by first understanding what a process is, just so that we can level set and make sure we're all looking at it through the same lens. So by simple definition, a process is a set of activities that are, of course, executed in a certain way in order to achieve a specific output. Outputs are generally those things that organizations produce to conduct their business. It could be something like a product or a service. Another output could be something like information in the form of a report. And that output could be the final product, or it could even be the input that kicks off another process. So breaking it down further, a process usually starts with some type of input. It could be something tangible like raw materials, or it could be intangibles such as information. And the kinds of processes that run in an organization are very dependent on the kind of organization that it actually is. But then that input will come into the process, that input will be worked on, and that input will be transformed, and then usually there will be some kind of output that's been produced. So with that context in mind, processes then are the foundation upon which businesses are built. It's that series of activities that organizations must execute repeatedly for them to do the work that they need to do. And for a process to be executed repeatedly in an effective manner, it's really important that the various components need to be understood if they're going to be orchestrated properly. Now, not only do we need to understand the individual building blocks, but we also need to understand how they fit together. Understanding the flow is really loosely what the practice of process understanding is all about. It's about understanding those components and ensuring that the right systems are in place for those processes to be executed repeatedly. But successful repetition is not the only reason for process understanding. Understanding the details of a process is as much about improving that process as part of continuous service kind of approaches and methodologies. When we have insight into the details of a process and how it's executed, it makes it a lot easier to identify areas that require attention. It helps identify things such as bottlenecks that happen to creep in over time, or other inefficiencies that get introduced once a process has been executed a number of times. Because no matter how well a process was designed initially, eventually people are going to start deviating from the initial process and find other ways of doing things. And this can often lead to too much variation in a process, which tends to do things like slowing that process down, making it taking a lot longer to actually produce those outputs and serve our customers, employees, partners, etc. It can also give rise to unnecessary rework. So having to repeat the same kinds of work over and over again, or readapt it because mistakes are creeping in, or it even introduces risk if things are being done in a way that shouldn't be. So being able to analyze your processes with up-to-date information becomes critical to correcting some of these issues which arise from time to time. And then additionally, for organizations to adapt to changing market conditions and to evolve and innovate, they need to be able to change how they do things. Now, I think we can all agree that changing how you do things is very difficult, if not impossible, if you don't have clear insight into your operational landscape and how work is actually being done from beginning to end. So process understanding techniques are meant to bring that right level of insight into how processes are being executed so that your processes can be understood, and then they can be streamlined and improved anytime they need to be. And then any change needed can be released quickly and effectively into the business. Now, we're talking about processes in organizations. What I'd like us to do is maybe just step out of that context for a few minutes. And think about executing processes in normal day-to-day life. And we might not think about it, but we do usually execute processes from the moment we wake up all the way through to when we go to sleep. So some examples are where we drop our kids off at school or we go to work. We normally execute a standard sequence of events that enable us to do that. And usually those are the same kind of events that we normally arrange in the same kind of way. So we do things like cooking. We could also be doing things like baking cakes, something that a lot of us are probably familiar with, having done it ourselves or seen other people do it. Now, if you think about baking a cake, right, you've got a certain desired output, right? In this case, it's the cake or any kind of baked goods. There are a set of activities that we need to execute. So we need to firstly make sure that we have the right ingredients. And let's pause there, because if you think about it, to actually have the right ingredients in the first place, you would have needed to have executed a previous process. We would have had to go to the store and buy the ingredients, or we would have placed an online order to get the ingredients delivered. Potentially, we could have got somebody else to go and buy those ingredients for us and then drop them off at the house. So you could think of that as executing the same process, so buying ingredients, but having 3 different variants of being able to do the same thing. So back to the baking. So once we have the ingredients, we then have to apply some work to them. We're going to need to ensure that our production method is available and ready. In this instance, that's going to be our oven, and the oven then needs to be preheated. We then apply all of the inputs, the ingredients in this case, where we mix them together, we pour the batter into the pan, and then it then gets placed into the oven for it to start baking. And hopefully, once we pull it out, it hasn't flopped, and we can then decorate it, and then the output is a finished cake that should hopefully look good and taste good. Now, for us to get the output that we're expecting, we need to understand all of those inputs, how to put them together, the work that needs to be applied to the inputs to get the results that we're looking for. And if we get any of that wrong, we could end up with something like this, a mess. Process understanding, in part, is about avoiding that mess and the possible disasters that may arise due to not having the right inputs or not being able to work those inputs correctly. And to be effective, the components need to be understood and then executed correctly, all in a particular sequence. And ensuring that you have the right inputs, work them correctly in the right sequence, is really what process understanding is all about. And if you do this repeatedly, you then have a process that you can then use every time. Once we have a repeatable process, that gives us an expected result. And once we have that expected result that we can get time and time again, we can then start looking for new ways and methods to either make better cakes or to make more cakes in the same amount of time. We can liken this to what's called continual service improvement, is a term that's used for that kind of concept in organizations. Now, these methods may mean that not only will our cakes look nicer and taste better, but perhaps we can produce more, or perhaps we can produce more in the same amount of time. We can then potentially end up selling them, and perhaps we then even spin off a business and start a bakery. So more formally, back to the business world. Businesses are executing processes every single day, and the nature of that business will determine the kind of process. It could be manufacturing processes, or it could be more common processes that all organizations are executing. So things like order to cash or purchase to pay. There could be processes to serve customers, or there could be internal processes to serve employees, such as IT or HR processes. Now, if we think of the typical large-scale, complex organizations that exist out there, their processes will usually span multiple boundaries across departments. They're going to be different people spread out all over the place. And they will normally be spread out across different regions. So there may be multiple handoffs, bi-directional flows of goods and services, passing of data back and forth. So with all of this complexity, it really becomes crucial that processes are understood in detail for organizations to then be successful. And I think it's fair to say that most, if not all, organizations understand this. For many years, businesses have spent a lot of time and effort to understand their processes, and they've been employing different mechanisms to gather the required insights. Firstly, we've been using manual process discovery techniques for years. This could be something like getting employees into a room and conducting user interviews. And I know sometimes those user interviews might seem like user interrogations, but nonetheless, it's a common practice where we try to understand users' work by having discussions with them. They fill out questionnaires and other similar kind of mechanisms. Usually in conjunction with that, it's going to kick off maybe something like a whiteboarding session where somebody's going to start sketching something on a whiteboard. Process maps are being drawn to capture inputs, activities, and outputs. And then further to that, in order to capture that human IP, documentation is something as people that we generally go to then capture that part of a process and its activities so that it can then be leveraged and shared by others out into the future. Now, while necessary, this does take a lot of time, effort, and money. Very often, by the time you've captured what the process landscape looks like, there have been enough substantial changes in the organization that make documentation and process models out of date and potentially of very little use. And it's really difficult sometimes to keep all of that IP or all of those artifacts up to date. So to do a better job of getting the right level of process understanding, organizations turn to technology to assist. And there's some fantastic technologies out there that try and solve the problems that we're kind of discussing from a process understanding point of view. So we've got things like process mapping tools. I'm thinking of the likes of Signavio, Aris, and others that help organizations build process libraries. These libraries contain things such as documentation. They will have your as-is and to-be models that organizations are working towards, and they can even generate process model simulations that help model the impact that process changes would make if implemented. And then there are process mining tools that can access application log files and extract volumes of transactional information. This information can then be visually displayed back and show what the process landscape actually looks like today with all of the different variants and paths that users are taking. And then there are task mining tools that run in the background on users' machines, and they collect a lot of detailed information on what a user is doing on their PC in order to understand work patterns. And then with a slight variation to that, there are also task discovery tools, which don't run in the background. They need to be started up. The point of those task discovery tools is that they would then discover the right tasks and processes that can then feed understanding in order to be converted into some other outputs. So things like documentation and automation assets. So combining these different solutions really helps create better insight into the process landscape, providing that transparency that organizations need, and helping to detect those patterns to understand the work that's being done. And well-implemented solutions and practices should lead to several benefits. So, as already mentioned, process understanding is really all about getting that detailed insight into operational processes and then presenting that insight back in ways that can be visually described and documented. It takes a lot of that manual effort out of the way, and it also takes some of that guesswork, or a lot of that guesswork, if not most of it, out of the way. And it's actually giving you live, up-to-date insight into how things are actually working. Then that visual information becomes easy to walk through and analyze in order to understand all of the different variation in the processes that are running your business and helping you identify those bottlenecks and other inefficiencies. And having ready access to this rich set of information means that corrective action can be taken to reduce variation and then to streamline activities to reduce redundancy and risk. And an interesting side effect of streamlined processes is that it becomes a lot easier then to start introducing automation to help drive further improvements. Additionally, bottlenecks and other inefficiencies can then also be identified more quickly. We can work towards eliminating them, and then focus can be placed on optimizing processes as part of continual service improvement efforts. And as organizations start making these improvements, there are other benefits that come into play that we would expect to see. So, for example, organizations can become more agile. They would be reducing wastage. So those activities that don't really need to exist in an organization, but do because of certain practices and approaches to working that were introduced over time. But also organizations that are more agile, doing the right things, can also better serve their customers, and orchestrated correctly, ideally would become more profitable as well. All right, so now that we've defined the world of process somewhat, let's start taking a look at test automation. But before we define test automation, we should briefly mention the world that it actually fits into. And that world is software testing. And for those who are on this call, I'm sure a lot of you know quite a bit about software testing, but just to frame it, for others that might be new to it. So software testing has been around for a pretty long time. It's been part of software development right from the very beginning, where we've needed to test software to ensure that bugs and defects were eliminated before we push changes to production systems. And it's an incredibly fair statement to make that testing has and always will play a critical function in ensuring that software development produces applications and services that are stable, can help us run our business, and are of sufficient quality to do the things that we require our applications and processes to actually do. Now, in the early years of software development, testing was primarily done by teams of developers or QA teams who used manual methods of testing. To support their work, different testing models, methodologies, and frameworks have been added that help testing teams do all of their work. And those continue to grow and evolve. But software testing was really revolutionized when automation started to be introduced into that domain. And automation now sits very squarely in the domain of testing, where we now have mature solutions that provide complete test automation platforms that do a lot of that heavy lifting for us. Okay, so now that we've framed test automation as a part of software testing, let's just quickly define it. Again, just to kind of set the scene and make sure that we're all looking at it through the correct lens. It's that process of using automation tools to manage test orchestration and test execution. It also is a method whereby we can also manage test data that gets fed into test executions, and then managing the results to improve software quality. So rather than having people from across the business and manually executing those test steps, automation tools can now take over and do a lot of that heavy lifting, which saves a lot of time and effort, with a host of other benefits that we're going to be looking at shortly. So while manual testing still has its place, there are some drawbacks to it, right? It requires, firstly, a higher number of people to do the testing. And what that ends up doing is taking people away from their core function. We can end up costing organizations a lot more than maybe they would have anticipated. And also, it's incredibly time consuming. The other drawback of manual testing is that you just can't test as much as you could potentially with an automation solution, which means that you then start getting less test coverage. the less you test, the greater the chance of you introducing defects into production. And then when you're finished, one of the biggest drawbacks is that you don't have a lot of reusable assets that you can use again in the next cycle. So the next time the next or the newest cycle begins, you pretty much then need to start from scratch again. So with test automation solutions, you can now solve all those kind of issues that I've just described and more. And it's worth mentioning here that these solutions have definitely matured over time, making them a lot easier to use. In the early days, you would need to build test scripts by programming and scripting. Setting it up could take a lot of time and effort, and it could be quite complex to use and maintain it, as it required typically a lot of technical knowledge. Now, testers, well, if you think about what needed to be done back in those days, we normally have an expression for that, where testers needed to write code in order to test code. And the impact of that would be projects being slowed down. These solutions could end up being more of a bottleneck rather than a help, due to that high degree of technical knowledge required in order to set up the automation, but also to maintain and then look after it. Now, with the advent of newer test automation solutions that were also introduced quite a few years back, the required skill needed to test applications has been decreasing. Because these solutions are now built on no-code or low-code frameworks, creating an automation library can now be done by people who don't have deep technical skills. This empowers more users from the business side to also then get involved in broader testing. And by shifting some of the load to the business, it helps accelerate testing, as business users have much more insight into their processes than what the testing teams do. We can then start relying on more of their knowledge to get the job done a lot faster and a lot quicker. That all leads into being able to then deliver changes into production a lot faster, just getting those benefits that you'd be expecting. So if done correctly, this can also then help build that greater collaboration between the business and the testing teams. And those benefits that I mentioned are those accelerated projects, faster release of changes, and higher quality software, to just name a few. Now, when we speak about testing, I already mentioned that it's a broad domain all on its own right. It's an incredibly large domain. And depending on where you are within a testing cycle, there are also different types of testing that you would need to do. So you might have heard of things like functional testing, system integration testing, regression tests, end-to-end business process testing are just some examples. Automation can be very well suited for these types of tests, and others, by the way, and can also add substantial value here in helping the business achieve its objectives. However, these are probably going to be topics for another day. What I'd like us to focus on is automated testing in two different phases of the application lifecycle. So there are usually two phases in that lifecycle where software is tested. One is in the development phase, when new applications are being developed or a significant update is actually being worked on. These would usually be handled as projects, and these projects are going to vary in size and complexity. You might also have multiple projects running at the same time, making it even more complex. So, for example, you would have some large transformational projects that introduce new core systems. These can typically take years to plan, develop, and deploy. That would be something like a S4HANA transformation project, where customers are either implementing SAP for the first time or are moving from ECC to S4HANA as part of either a greenfield, brownfield, or hybrid approach. The main goal when testing within this part of the life cycle is usually to validate that these new systems or additional and enhanced capabilities will work as intended. The focus is on validating this new functionality, and very importantly, testing integrations with the rest of the ecosystem that these new systems are going to be fitting into, and then just ensuring that the application meets those specified requirements. Within a project context, large volumes of testing are usually undertaken. As these projects are so transformational, they have the potential to introduce a lot of risk. I've heard a statistic not too long ago when implementing these kinds of projects, approximately 30 to 40% of the time can actually be spent on manual testing alone. So using automation to handle a lot of the testing load can significantly reduce the amount of human effort required, and it frees up people to focus on other project-related activities. And then additionally to that, automation can run repetitive test steps, reducing human error and then help increase that test coverage that can't easily be done when just doing manual testing. What this ends up doing is, of course, then ensuring that defects are found sooner, and they can be fixed a lot earlier as well. A defect found in dev or in QA is a lot cheaper to fix than a defect that's been found in production. And then the side benefit or an additional benefit to all of this is that this helps speed up the delivery of these projects while also then de-risking them at the same time. Secondly, testing happens within a business as usual context. The focus here is primarily on ensuring that ongoing operations run smoothly with the applications that you're using, and those applications supporting your processes. So the focus here is on maintenance changes, releasing maybe patches and fixes. So those would be routine checks or minor functional updates that introduce maybe small new functionality, those kind of things, and then ensuring that the application is stable and performs optimally are some of the main objectives. Now, even though these changes by themselves are smaller in nature, the typical enterprise today is dealing with a large volume of these application changes. And even though the changes may be considered smaller, the negative impact of a change, if not tested properly, can be detrimental to an organization. And whether it's changes that developers in an organization are releasing themselves or changes released by software SaaS vendors, those changes are constant and they are ever increasing and becoming more challenging to manage. This is where automation can then also help by managing that huge volume of testing that's required to ensure that these changes won't be breaking anything in production when released. By using automation, these changes can be tested faster with less human effort, allowing organizations to release those changes into production faster without impacting quality negatively. So what are some of the benefits of test automation? There are many, we've touched on some of them already, but let's go through some of them again at a high level. So what you can expect to see when using automation for testing is greater efficiency. Test automation tools can execute tests at scale with the ability to test more over shorter periods of time. So you can really run and orchestrate your automation at schedules that make sense as part of your standard operational needs or as part of CI/CD kind of pipelines. Not only is this important for testing different process variations, but it allows you to successfully test high volumes of different data combinations as well. What this also means is that you can increase your test coverage. When testing manually, there's only so much process variation and data combinations that humans can test. And there are only so many people that you can throw at testing before the cost and the time actually outweigh the benefits that you're going to be getting. With automation, you can scale your test assets, allowing you to test more, which means that you have a much greater chance of finding those defects a lot earlier and a lot sooner. And with a library of test automation assets, you can also test more regularly as you've now got a library of reusable assets that you can run anytime that you then want to. Whereas with manual testing, you don't normally have any assets that you can generally reuse afterwards. You've got to start from scratch each and every time. And then finding defects early means that you're doing a better job of de-risking your environment, those processes that you're running, allowing you to get to the outputs that you're looking for more repeatably, and getting that consistent quality. So the more you test, the more assurance you're building into those applications and processes, and then finding more defects and resolving them means that you then end up delivering greater quality into production. And greater quality and more stable systems results in things like higher employee satisfaction, which sets up that foundation for something that all organizations are ultimately looking for, better customer experience, which enables them to see more profitability. All right, so why combine them? We've introduced process discovery and test automation as separate disciplines and separate domains. And as I've described at a high level, each of them providing tremendous benefits. So the question for this webinar really is, can they actually be combined? Can process understanding lead to better testing? So remember this, we looked at this previously, the concept of baking a cake, and that entire concept being the same as executing a process in a business context. It involves having the right inputs, working on them, and getting that expected output. Someone that doesn't understand what cake we're trying to bake, what the ingredients should be, how they should be mixed, how the oven works, will most likely not get the desired result that we're looking for. So from a testing perspective, understanding the components of a process and how they fit together to get the required output is crucial to ensuring that the right things are tested. Processes in QA that are not aligned to production processes could result in us not testing the right things, or we could be wasting time testing the wrong things. So without the right levels of process insight, we don't have the full assurance that we've covered everything that needs to be tested, or in other words, we don't know if we have sufficient test coverage. So if we release a change and something breaks because of our lack of process insight, we're going to get that mess, those unintended results. Now, these results could be a lot more serious than just a cake gone wrong. Software defects and bugs could result in outages that cost millions in lost revenue. They impact customer perception, or they could even result in regulatory fines, costing the business a lot of money, as well as reputational loss. And those are just to name a few issues that could potentially then arise from lack of process insight when it comes to testing. So having a way to communicate process insights to QA and testing teams can provide immense business value in helping them identify those gaps easier, which then means that they can reduce that risk faster and be more proactive in ensuring that they've got the right test coverage at the process level. Enabling those QA and testing teams with the right levels of process information helps them to do a much better job. So what I want to do is just spend the next couple of minutes just taking you through some of what we're doing at Worksoft to make testing better. What we've done is we've created a platform that brings process understanding and test automation together as an integrated solution to help deliver on the benefits that we've been discussing. So what we're going to do is just walk through some of what that looks like, and then as we go along, I'll expand on the value that this consolidated approach brings to testing. So what we've done is we've taken what I call a real holistic approach, where we're taking process information from different sources and then combining high-level and detailed information together to help drive better testing and better automation across the organization. These different process sources, and we'll discuss what those process sources are in a minute, are all brought together into our process intelligence capability, where we then consolidate them together, blend them together, and then present it back visually, which allows different teams to then analyze the information to help inform better decision making. So let's look at some of those sources, and in no particular order. The first one I'm going to mention is that we can ingest process information from process mining tools. What this does is it gives testing teams instant visibility into those operational processes, and we can then detect patterns in how processes are being executed. Process mining as a source is fantastic, it's invaluable, it's great at providing the big picture. However, what it doesn't give us are the details around how users are stepping through applications to get their work done. For that, we use our Worksoft business capture tool that discovers the detailed user activity that users are taking as they're walking through their processes in an application. What this does is gives us the step level information that we need that describes what should be tested at a step level. And then additionally to that, it doesn't just give us that detailed process insight, but off these captures, we can also generate and create the base assets that we need to automatically generate process documentation and the test automation assets that we need to do the testing. Thirdly, we can ingest process models through BPMN files that are created by our process teams. Those can be imported and ingested, and we can use that information to supplement the sources that I've already mentioned. Testing teams can then use this to understand what the process teams have modeled as those happy paths that they would want us to test at a minimum in order to ensure compliance. And then the testing teams can adjust their testing to ensure that these activities are in actual fact being covered. Then as you start building your automation library, you're going to be running those assets to do your testing. And a subset of that information will then get returned back and be stored in process intelligence, which then creates an additional visual layer where you can see what you're testing. Very importantly, not only can you see what you're testing, you'll be able to visualize what you're not testing at the process layer. it becomes a great way to quickly identify gaps. These gaps are potentially where risk might actually exist in the business. So at a process level, you can visualize those areas of potential risk so that they can, in essence, then be mitigated from a testing point of view. And then to complete the picture, Worksoft, by the way, can also run automation in production. Now, I know that a lot of you are familiar with us as a test automation platform, but we do have orchestration capability where you can use that same library of automation that you're building for testing and then use it in production where it makes sense as well. So what will end up happening as you're running production automation by using Worksoft capabilities, this automation will also write back to process intelligence and can be viewed on the same process map so that you can actually see where the business is profiting from production automation, and then also use that information to help drive your roadmap further to uncover other opportunities and activities and processes that might benefit from automation. Now, that's a lot of process information that we can combine, but we can combine it really meaningfully to provide a more enriched view of your processes to help drive that better testing. I just want to pause here and then also just mention that you don't have to have each of these sources, right? So a lot of our customers might not have things like process mining or BPMN diagrams. That's okay. You don't have to have all of it. You could be using our business capture tool, running automation with our orchestration capabilities in pre-production and production, and then build things out as you go along. But however, if you do have those other sources, we can then enhance the value that you're getting from those investments by also using that process information for testing as well. So let's go and take a look at what this looks like in practice. Now, when you start out, you're going to start out with a blank canvas. If you're an existing Worksoft customer, you may already have captures and test automation that you've run. You can import all of those sources of data and then add other sources as you're going along. Or if you're a new customer, you may start with BPMN diagrams or process mining, and then add test automation as you're building your library and then running and executing it. So you can pretty much start any way that you wish. For this discussion, we're going to start with importing some BPMN diagrams. So as you then import these BPMN diagrams, these target operating models, you're going to see them flash up on the screen here as a process with orange activities. This operating model or this target operating model is just a fictional description of what we want our order to cash process to look like. So this is something that our process team has actually modeled. As a testing team, we're going to need to ensure that we are testing these activities as a minimum. So to accelerate that process, we can get assistance from our business users who understand what those activities look like and how the work is done. We can get them to use our capture tool so they can capture those activities by using that tool. What this will help do is hand over process knowledge from the business users in a much faster and more streamlined manner so that we can then automatically create documentation and test automation assets from them. So it becomes a really useful mechanism to bring the business and IT closer together and helps facilitate a smoother handover of that information that our testing teams actually need. So what does it actually look like in practice? Now, Capture is a lightweight tool that we deploy to any kind of user. It could be to somebody from the business side. And by business side, I'm using that as a very generic term. So it could be the business user themselves, it could be a business analyst, a functional consultant, or it could actually be somebody on the automation side or the IT side. The persona doesn't really matter. The idea is to put Capture into the hands of somebody who understands the process and then just allow them to walk through it. And what Capture will do is discover the sequence of steps that they're actually going through and generate an easy to understand narrative of each and every step. It also captures the data that they're using, as well as taking a snapshot of each and every step. Now, what you'll notice here is that the user isn't doing anything different other than just stepping through a transaction like they normally would. So just going and executing their activities in the process, and Capture is pretty much just doing the rest. And then you've got some abilities to add some additional steps in by doing things like adding comments, capturing additional snapshots, everything that you need in order to be able to discover a process effectively in order for you to then be able to convert that into other assets that you can then use for testing. So this again becomes very effective. It eliminates the need for things like whiteboarding sessions, getting users into a room. I'm not saying that you're going to be able to replace those completely, but you will be able to substantially save a lot of time when it comes to handling process information from one team to another. So there's a lot of value in being able to use that tool for that purpose, in order to crowdsource that process information in order for you to be able to speed up the creation of automation libraries and documentation and other assets that you need for effective testing. So once the user is finished with their capture, it's going to get stored in our process library. They appear in the process map, where they will then get aligned to activities that come in from other sources. So what we can see here is that we've got 2 captures, and they've been aligned to these activities that have come from that target model. And as our users start capturing more activities, they will then start appearing on the map. We're then going to be starting to build out all this different variation that exists in the way that our users actually work. So the map starts to take shape, and we start building further insight into what those processes look like with all of the different variants and activities. What we can then do is we can then analyze all of those captures and compare them to see where there are differences and where they align. So what you can do is actually select these captures and drill into them, and then you get all of the step level detail that's stored in the library, which becomes easy to go through in order to understand the detail of how users are doing the work that we need them to test. We can then select which of these are valid activities, and then at a click of a button, we can then document them. We generate this business process documentation, and we can export them to Word or PDF format. So you don't need to then generate all of these documents manually anymore, having people work in Word, capturing snapshots, typing in narratives, capturing data manually. A lot of this can be automated by using Capture. So these documents contain all of the details of that capture, of that process discovery. You've got that sequence of steps again that the users went through. You've got the data that they used, and then you get that snapshot of each and every step, which then gets exported into these documents. And then you've got a BPMN diagram of the process that the user went through, which, by the way, can be exported and used in other tools as well. So things like Signavio and Slowness, you can supplement those other systems with all of this process information as well. Now, this documentation can also be used for different purposes. It can be used to transfer information from the business user to the automation teams. It can be used for things like UAT testing. So users can use these documents to guide them through their manual testing. It can also be used for things like training and enablement. So when rolling out new systems, a big part of that is training users to use the system. And by using Capture, not only are we then building test scripts and test cases, but you're also building the assets that can be used to enable users to use these systems as well. And then there are other use cases beyond testing. So being able to generate documentation for audit and compliance, for governance purposes, etc. What we can then do is, once we've analyzed those captures, documented them, at a click of a button, those captures that are of interest to us can then be converted into automation assets that we can then use for testing. They will then get pushed through to our automation studio, where the test team can then pick up on them and then do further work on them to build out a library of automation assets that you can then run anytime that you want to. So what does that look like in practice? Here we've got a quick example of a couple of captures that we've converted into automation. There's 4 of them, and we've put them into an end-to-end process that we're going to now be running in order to test the 2 or 3 activities within the order to cash process that we've actually created. So we're now giving it over to the automation engine, which has taken those captures that we've put together. And it's worth mentioning here that those captures end up as building blocks within the automation library. You can just take those building blocks, string them together into an end-to-end test, and then run them whenever you need to do your testing. So here's just an example of that being done from those captures that we were looking at previously. All the way through to the very end, when eventually, once the test is finished running, we're going to be getting the results that get returned back. And then a subset of those results will then return into process intelligence as well, which we're going to take a look at shortly. So the automation is running, it's finishing. We get these results back showing us the status of the execution, so whether it's passed or failed. And then taking a subset of that data, we return it back into process intelligence. And you'll see here that our map starts lighting up in blue. So the more we test by using Worksoft automation, the more we're going to see reflected back into our process map over here. You can see all of these activities starting to light up in blue, where we're then building this visual picture that's giving us insight into our test automation coverage. We can see what's being tested, and then of course we can see what's not being tested. And this is where we can then start identifying gaps in our testing. These activities in white that we're looking at over here, that's where the gaps are and areas where we might potentially be at risk. So how would we then start looking to then close those risks? We could look at those activities from the target model, the ones highlighted in orange that we haven't automated yet. We would then ensure that the happy path is being tested by getting our users to go and capture those activities, generate them into automation assets that the testing team picks up on, hardens those scripts, runs them, and then we get those results returned back into PI. And then we can move to the rest of them. What we're also doing when we're running those results and getting that information returned back into process intelligence is that we're also getting test automation results returned back into the process view here. What that allows you to do is get a high-level picture of the success or the failures of all the tests running in your organization at a process level. So by looking at our filters here at the bottom, or our map at the bottom here, we can see that we've got this test pass rate indicator here, which appears as a blue bar. Anything that's in blue over here, solid blue, means that all of our testing on these activities is working as it should, and we're getting 100% success rate right across the board, these 4 activities. But the one with an orange part to the bar over here, this is where we start to see some failures. So we've got the ability to then drill down further, and we can then see what the pass or the failure rate is. So across these other activities over here, we're getting a 100% pass rate. What we're getting on this activity for some reason is a failure rate of 40%. Again, a way of being able to highlight this risk at a process level. What we can then do is instigate some type of workflow for somebody to go and investigate and find out why testing is failing on this particular activity, because there's definitely risk here. We don't want to introduce anything into production or release change here and then potentially cause some kind of failure. So this is important, right? Somebody needs to take a look at this. And then, as I mentioned previously, we've got the ability to run automation in production. So as you start doing that, your process map is then going to start lighting up with this green color that you're seeing over here. So we've got these 2 activities in our order to cash process where we're using Worksoft production automation to automate these activities and this part of the process over here. So what we're doing is, as I've mentioned at the start of this, is we're taking multiple sources and combining them into one view to give you that enriched view of your process, but filtered through that automation lens, helping you make those better decisions and then getting the benefits of combining process understanding and test automation all into one. All right, so let's again take a look at some of these benefits before we start wrapping up. By using process understanding in testing, what we're really doing is helping test teams understand these processes and how they really are being executed in production. These teams can then take a more data-driven approach to ensuring that activities and processes being tested in QA really match the processes that are running in production and that there is one-to-one alignment there. This helps ensure that we're testing the right things, as we've mentioned, and that there are no gaps in our end-to-end process testing, and that we've got sufficient test coverage. Now what we can do is back that test coverage with actual real facts, real data, and ensuring that more accurate alignment exists between QA and production teams. Testing teams can then also be more effective by testing not only the happy path, but then even other variants that perhaps even business analysts and others are not even aware of. Because we're using all of this information from these different data sources, we can expose a lot more, a lot faster. And then by incorporating process understanding in testing, we're also helping testing teams adapt to changes faster. If there are new process variants that become evident or a new activity that pops up on the screen that aren't part of their testing cycles, They can then analyze the data, go back to the business, understand it in more detail, and then if needed, create automation to test these new activities and variants. What this does is transition these testing teams to be more proactive rather than only waiting on others to tell them what needs to be tested. So it builds up a much better partnership between our QA teams and the business. It facilitates that better collaboration between process teams, business users, and testing teams. And then by sharing process information between different stakeholders, we can ensure that there's better quality that's being built into the process landscape. What this ends up doing is having a much more positive impact right across the organization. Better quality software will, of course, lead to robust processes, and that leads to higher employee morale and satisfaction, which then lays that foundation for being able to better serve our partners, suppliers, and ultimately our customers more effectively and better. Everybody, I really appreciate your time today. I hope you found that valuable. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so what I'm going to do is just stop the presentation there and then maybe hand it over to Austin just to read out any questions that might have actually come in. Austin, maybe over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, we've got time for at least one or two questions. We've got a couple here. The first one is, can you explain the difference between using process mining data and your capture tool?
Yeah, good question. All right, so let's go into process mining first. Now, process mining is great at being able to tap into databases and application logs in order to go and get process information that has been around in our databases for a specific period of time. It allows you to get instant access to the process and the way that process is being executed through different variants and different parts. What process mining really focuses on is exposing that information at what I call a high level, right? So what you're going to do is maybe tap into your database and extract order to cash information. What you're going to see are all of the activities that make up that order to cash process and the sequence that those activities are being executed in across different kinds of variants. But what you're not getting at the process mining level is detailed information. Detailed information is what testing teams need in order to be able to test effectively. So what we're doing is we can take that high level information that process mining is giving and then use our capture tool to go and get that step level detail that we require. And then as part of our capabilities, we can then combine the two together and then give you that better process understanding by taking the high level and the detail and putting it together. Also worth mentioning again that what capture allows you to do is not just go and discover the step level detail, but we can use that information to generate documentation and automation, which is again something that process mining can't do.
Great. And one other one is, can you use your capture tool on any kind of application?
You pretty much can on a lot of applications. I wouldn't say all. So it's very well suited for any kind of web application. You can use it for SAP GUI. You can use it for Oracle Forms. You can use it for some type of mainframe emulators that exist out there. You can even use it for mobile applications. We've got a mobile interface that allows us to capture applications on Android and iPhone, etc. So a wide array of different applications that we can capture against at a capture level. But I do want to pause and say that's on the capture side. On the automation side, we can pretty much automate any kind of application using different tools that we've got as part of that no-code platform that we actually offer.
Great. I think we're almost at time, so we'll go ahead and wrap there. Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning, or like Nick said, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. We hope you gained some useful insights to apply to your organization's test automation strategies. A link to the recording will be sent out within the next business day, and other than that, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.